Mark
reckless. Why
Zuckerberg,
should we
the founder
trust
of Facebook, is one of the
Facebook?
most hated
We have made a lot of
people
mistakes in running the
first
company.
world. I say first world because in other countries with less developed internet infrastructure, such as Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, Facebook has become synonymous with the concept of the internet, which is overwhelmingly liked, and Zuckerberg is thus, by association, probably more liked than he is in the West. For in the West, especially over the period from 2010 to 2021, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have been inundated with scandal after scandal after scandal, all of which have ultimately eroded away the golden boy image he created long ago when he created Facebook out of his dorm room in Harvard. Mark Zuckerberg, the great connector, 21st century icon, forged and wielded an incredibly powerful double-edged sword. With it, he had the power to, and did, connect the world in ways it had never been connected before. But far too many times, he inadvertently or complicitly allowed Facebook to sow the seeds of great division that have arguably sprouted into one of the greatest partisan divides in American history. With Facebook, in many ways, the great connector became a great divider. And now, with Meta, he aims to shed the sins of his past and start anew, and hopefully be welcomed back into the public's warm embrace. At least, that's what we're led to believe. To understand why so many people hate Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, and fear what they might do with Meta, we have to look back through the lens of time and see where it all went wrong.
Yay.
What?
I got accepted.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
All right!
In 2002, Mark Zuckerberg was accepted into Harvard University, the prestigious private Ivy League school where he would famously create the biggest social media company on the planet, Facebook. The company, which would grow to over 2.91 billion monthly active users, had humble, modest, scandalous beginnings that foreshadowed some of the same issues that plagues Facebook today. Zuckerberg's first creation, a service called FaceMash, where students judged the attractiveness of their peers, was immensely popular, but equally scandalous. In building the service, Zuckerberg violated university policy by acquiring photos and other personal data without the consent of the people at hand, resulting in the service being shuttered shortly after its creation. This setback didn't hinder Mark though, and was quickly followed by his magnum opus, the Facebook. Like FaceMash, Facebook was born out of controversy and chaos. In now leaked SMS messages, it was revealed that Mark Zuckerberg was recruited to build a service similar to what would become Facebook by the Winklevoss twins, and instead chose to build his own, choosing to, quote, fuck them over and quit on them when he said he'd have it done. In the same messages, not long after creating Facebook, Mark commented on the number of emails, pictures, and addresses that he had acquired, labeling those that gave them to him as dumb fucks. In later texts, as he worried about getting kicked out of Harvard for unethical behavior, after the Winklevoss twins told Harvard about his actions, he would go on to say that you can be unethical and still be legal. That's the way I live my life. Now, granted that Zuckerberg was a young, late teenager at the time when he made these dumb comments, and who among us can say we've never said dumb things before? The fact remains that what Mark said then and how Facebook currently operates are pretty similar, meaning that these comments by Zuckerberg can be taken as rare glimpses into how, at least to some degree, the current Mark Zuckerberg likely thinks. Fast forward over 1 million users later to December 2007, and Facebook faces its first big advertising privacy issue with a service called Beacon. With it, companies could track purchases by Facebook users and notify their Facebook friends on what their friend bought, all without said friend's consent. An example given at the time was that if you rented a movie from now defunct Blockbuster could then send an ad out to all your friends essentially saying, hey, I like this movie and maybe you'll like it too. After public outcry and failure to modify it to acceptable standards in fall 2009, Facebook was forced to abandon the Beacon service. Later, in 2010, it was revealed that popular Facebook games, Texas Hold'em and Farmville, were leaking data on Facebook users to third-party data mining and advertising companies. In many cases, the game developers weren't even aware that their games were leaking users' identities. According to Facebook, they didn't know this was happening either and would immediately begin working on plugging these holes in their ship. Though this specific data leak incident might not have been intentional, it foreshadows the many other data leaks, breaches, and misuse of data that would come to haunt Facebook in the coming years. It also marks yet another incident in which the public lost faith and trust in Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook to protect and use their data properly. And it wouldn't be the last. By the turn of the decade in 2010, Facebook had acquired 482 million monthly active users, and it showed no sign of slowing down. It was without a doubt the undisputed king of social media, but it wasn't alone. Its now essentially defunct rival at the time, MySpace, had 63 million monthly users on its platform. Launched in the same year, by December of 2010, Instagram had already acquired over 1 million users. Twitter, founded in 2006, had acquired 54 million users. WhatsApp, founded in 2009, had acquired 10 million users. And 1 year later, in 2011, Snapchat would be founded, and like Instagram, within a year, it would also go on to surpass 1 million users. The rapid growth of these platforms presented threats to the fragile supremacy Facebook had over them, and it wasn't guaranteed that Facebook would be able to fend them off. To ensure their future, Facebook decided that the best course of action would be to wipe out their competition by devouring them. In 2012, shortly after passing 50 million users, Facebook acquired Instagram for $1 billion. 2 years after surpassing 400 million users, Facebook acquired WhatsApp, and in the same year acquired virtual reality startup Oculus for $1 billion. Not all companies fell into his embrace, however. In 2008, Facebook attempted to acquire Twitter repeatedly for around $500 million and failed. In 2013, Facebook tried to acquire Snapchat for $3 billion and failed. Either way, Facebook now had well over 1 billion users and was a full-blown monopoly. But that wasn't enough. Spurned by Snapchat, Mark and Facebook decided that if they couldn't own it, they'd clone it. So they cloned the snaps of Snapchat with Instagram stories and nearly killed Snapchat in the process. Fast forward to 2020 to 2021, they cloned new social media companies TikTok and Clubhouse with Instagram Reels and Facebook Live audio rooms respectively, both of which, like Instagram stories, were nearly identical to their originals. On their Oculus platform, Facebook did the same, copying Your Fit, SideQuest, and Virtual Desktop and transforming them into Oculus Move, Apple App, and Airlink. And while they haven't thus far, they've also threatened to do the same with big screen VR. It's easy to see then how these monopolistic antitrust tendencies by Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have caused many to hate, be wary, and distrust him and his company's immense power and influence. However, that hate and distrust would only grow stronger.
Standard.
Well, I hope
you called it the gold standard of trade deals. You said it's the finest deal you've ever seen.
No.
And then you heard what I said about it, and all of a sudden you were against it.
Well, Donald, I know you live in your own reality, but that is not the fact.
In late 2016, during the United States presidential election, Facebook became a hotbed for misinformation, helping to trademark the term fake news. During the run-up to the election, articles suggesting Hillary Clinton was a murderer or that Donald Trump was endorsed by the Pope ran rampant on the platform. Facebook did not have the needed tools in place to detect and nip the misinformation in the bud, and as a result, millions of Americans were spoon-fed and voted based on false information. In the end, Donald Trump ascended to the presidency while Facebook descended into chaos and was subjected to widespread outrage internally and by the public, as many rightfully believed that Facebook had inadvertently played a role in affecting the election. This was just the beginning. In 2018, Americans, Europeans, and the world at large were in furor after coming to terms with the realization that Facebook had inadvertently leaked the raw data of around 85 million Facebook users to a third-party political consulting firm, Cambridge Analytica, that ultimately could have played a role in electing Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016. The full story here is convoluted and detracts from the main point of the video, but briefly though, In a nutshell, a Russian-American researcher, Alexander Kogan, at Cambridge University, created a quiz app that 270,000 Facebook users used. Through this quiz app, the 270,000 Facebook users, as well as their friends, had their data captured. This data was sent to Cambridge Analytica, where it was used by Donald Trump's presidential campaign, all without any of the 85 million knowing. While the method used by Kogan goes against Facebook policy, it was still allowed to transpire, which lies at the crux of the issue here. Users give their data to Facebook with the belief that said data will only be used in ways they have agreed to let it be used. As this incident happened under Facebook's watch, and there was such a large delay between the incident and when the afflicted users were made aware, it's clear why trust in Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have plummeted, while dislike for both have skyrocketed. Later, in 2018, the distrust and hatred for both would soar even higher due to Facebook once again allowing the platform to become hijacked, this time by radicals in the nation of Myanmar who abused the platform to incite violence and genocide on its own people. Once again, Facebook was too slow to act. For decades, the nation's population of about 50 million people suffered from censorship as well as political and social divisions, all of which were amplified when Facebook unwittingly entered the country. As mentioned earlier, Myanmar is a nation where Facebook has become synonymous with the concept of the internet. Here, phones come pre-installed with Facebook, thus emphasizing the platform's ubiquity. As few Myanmar citizens were digitally literate, they were unable to distinguish between factual information and disinformation, making them vulnerable to the hate speech that ran rampant on Facebook. This hate speech, misinformation, incitation of violence, as well as fake account usage all go against Facebook's policies, but they weren't strongly enforced. Knowing this, Myanmar military officials utilized the platform to engage in a systematic campaign targeting the Muslim Rohingya minority, a campaign of which resulted in the rape, murder, and forced migration of this group. After the damage had been done, Facebook took down the accounts of military leaders responsible for the genocide, but for many, it was too little, too late. According to Matthew Smith of Fortify Rights, a non-profit human rights organization that focuses on Southeast Asia, many people at Facebook knew for a long time that the company should have done more to prevent the gross misuse of its platform in Myanmar. The question then is, why didn't they? Why did they fail to act? As similar incidents continue to transpire in other countries like Sri Lanka and the Philippines, the world can't help but ask, can we trust Mark Zuckerberg to regain control of his platform even as it continues to spiral out of control? And as his platform has the power to influence our lives to such an extent, should we leave it in his control? Should someone else step in? As Facebook enters the next decade under Mark Zuckerberg's leadership, it seems that some of the same issues that have bogged Facebook over the years show no sign of stopping. In late 2021, after being leaked, it was revealed that over a period of 3 years, Facebook had conducted research into how Instagram affected its millions of young users, reportedly finding that, especially for young girls, Instagram was extremely toxic and damaging to their self-image. Some of the excerpts from that report are as follows. 32% of teen girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rates of anxiety and depression. This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. 13% of British users and 6% of American users said the desire to kill themselves came from Instagram. These findings were reviewed and presented to top Facebook executives in 2020, but Mark Zuckerberg repeatedly declined to make these findings public. He would, however, go on to publicly say that the research that we've seen is that using social apps to connect with other people can have positive mental health benefits. While this statement is likely true, as Zuckerberg, who is well aware of the findings of the report, fails to mention the report's findings at all, his statement is actually misinformation. It wasn't until after the report was leaked to the public by the Wall Street Journal that it became apparent that Facebook was choosing to enter the next decade repeating its practice of non-transparency. It doesn't help that in light of the reporting, Facebook failed to do much to address the issues. Facebook also continued the sins of its past throughout the 2020 and ongoing global pandemic, when misinformation about COVID-19 ran rampant on the platform. While Mark Zuckerberg sought to use Facebook to promote legitimate information about COVID-19 and the vaccines, the platform and his efforts, as it always has, was hijacked by anti-vaxxers and misinformation. Credible posts were bombarded with false, misleading propaganda, which in turn caused arguments between those wishing to correct, those wishing to continue to spread misinformation, and those who were simply confused. Since Facebook's algorithm promotes posts that gets lots of engagement, likes, comments, and shares, these posts, infected with misinformation, got promoted by the algorithm and thus spread misinformation to the masses, which in turn led to more needless death offline. As incident after incident occurs with no sign of stopping, and each resulting in more misinformation and loss of life, it has become increasingly clear that the problem with Facebook is Facebook, and as its head, Mark Zuckerberg. In each, there's just too much not to like.